Good evening. My guest today is a writer and social media influencer. It's Derek Eyre. Derek, in his authorship for magazine Halvia, described an article in which he detailed the career of West Germany's most prolific goal scorer, the legendary Gerd Müller. But it was an article with a twist. Not only did it document the achievements of the bomber, it posed an interesting question. Have the German national team ever truly found a replacement for Gerd Müller? Derek, how are you, sir?
I'm fine, Phil. Nice to see you again. It's been a while.
And you, mate. Yeah, we were just talking beforehand. Me and Derek are the non-alcoholic lager louts of the Midlands, aren't we? We've met up before and quaffed on 0% lagers, which were delicious, actually. Surprisingly good in Birmingham city centre. But it's good to see you again, buddy. Yeah. Now, tell us a little about your admiration of Gerd Müller. I mean, evidently, everyone who knows about football admires Gerd Müller. But many of our listeners will have heard the name, some of the younger ones, but not know what made him so special. So, can you talk us through that for us?
Well, strangely enough, it's a Billy Boots type story. The first real pair of football boots I got when I played primary school football were actually Adidas Franz Beckenbauer. Beckenbauer was always my hero. And I grew out of them at the end of primary school. And I didn't have a new pair of boots, but my cousin, who had recently got a new pair of boots, had these old molded stud Adidas ones called Gerd Müller Goal, spelt G-O-L, Goal, the German way. So I took them and played with them, and I thought, I need to find out more about Gerd Müller. I knew about Beckenbauer, but I was, being a sort of defender and defensive midfielder, I was more drawn to the Kaiser rather than the bomber. But then my boys' brigade team switched me to playing up front, and I couldn't stop scoring goals. And I wondered whether. So I found out more about this Gerd Müller, and of course, European football wasn't on the telly very much then. You'd get sports night on a Wednesday night. And I remember the first European Cup I watched was a 75 one between Leeds and Bayern Munich. So, of course, I was watching Gerd Müller for the first time on telly. And I remember that game. I don't remember it being a terribly exciting game. It seemed to be, my memory is Leeds fans throwing seats onto the pitch at the end of the game and the commentator saying what a disgrace this was. But really, it was 1976. The final was at Hampden against Saint Etienne. And I remember I watched it with my grandfather. And, even though Müller didn't score that night, he was just such a tremendous, I was drawn to him. He looked like my type of player. He looked like the most unlikely centre forward you had ever seen. He was small like me. He was squat like me. But boy, he just seemed to be everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say that about him, don't he? He wasn't the conventional footballer, never mind forward. But low centre of gravity and fast over short distances, although not really a sprinter. It was like he conserved his energy for doing the damage in the penalty area.
Yeah, I mean, the goals, for example, that Uli Hoeneß scored against Dresden in the European Cup in 73, Müller wouldn't have been able to score them. He wouldn't have been able to take the ball from the halfway line and sprint the length of the pitch round a keeper and slot it in. That wasn't his type. That wasn't his type of play. And in fact, when he was brought to Bayern in the sort of mid-60s, the coach didn't want him. The coach said, "What am I going to do with this little fat guy? He's not going to amount to anything." Well, some people eat their words, don't they?
Well, of course. I mean, he certainly had the kind of magic touch when it came to scoring goals. So let's delve a little bit into that early career, because we were talking before we came online. We say he sort of arrived at kind of the right time in German football, because in 1963, German football became professional. The Bundesliga was kind of inaugurated, and he was entering into an era where Germany hadn't been particularly successful as a nation, or West Germany as they were at the time, hadn't been particularly successful as a nation. Would you like to talk us through that a little bit about the lack of success and where he came from and how he arrived?
Yeah, I mean, by 1970, he was coming into the West German national team in time for the Mexico World Cup, and this at a time, of course, when Bayern were not the top team in Germany. In fact, they weren't even the top team in Munich. 1860 Munich had won a Bundesliga a couple of years earlier. The Bundesliga had only been around since the early to mid 60s anyway, and of course, it must have stuck in the throats of Bayern that 1860 won a championship before they did. So I mean, he could have gone to 1860. He went to Bayern instead, but the 70 World Cup, he just exploded on the scene with the goals against England and then the goals against Italy in the semi-final, although ultimately they were unsuccessful against Italy. But that was a time when Germany were building. I mean, they'd been in the 66 final, lost to England, rather controversially. And a lot of their players were retiring. Zähler was at the end of his career. I think Helmut Haller would have been towards the end of his career. And they were rebuilding, and Müller was one of the younger players. I'm not even sure he was taken to the World Cup as a first choice striker. I seem to think that perhaps he was there as backup to Zähler, but in the end, his goals against England and Italy really propelled him onto the international scene.
Yeah, they were looking for a replacement, so it was very much a case of right place at the right time, wasn't it, for him? Because but he was plucked from virtual obscurity in '66 by Bayern. He played for 1861 Nord Lingen,
a regional league team at that time. Yeah,
that was his place of birth, wasn't it? In about a season and a bit, he scored 51 goals in about 30 odd games there. So that's what interested Bayern. But you said when he went to Bayern, they weren't particularly keen on him. Right? There was a couple of people who weren't keen on him at the club.
Yeah, I mean, this is a man who I suppose the closest you could come to describing him is a man with like turkey legs. I mean, if you imagine a turkey leg after Christmas, it's got this huge thigh and then these sort of really narrow legs below the knee. And that's what he was like. He had these huge thighs. I mean, he was just, but he was so strong on the ball. He was very hard to push off. And I think he had a sizable rear end as well that he used to great effect. He was the first player I remember who you would see backing into a defender to kind of force him off the ball. At that time, strikers would have really taken the ball very much in front of themselves, running onto them, or cut back from a byline to slot in or head in. But a lot of the time, the ball was played to Müller in the box, and his back was often to goal. And he had this amazing 180-degree swivel where he could shoot with both feet. And the number of goals I've seen on YouTube and in matches where he does exactly that. He gets the ball with his back to goal, and quick as a flash, he's turned and he's smashed the ball, usually into the far corner.
Yeah. I mean, very tenacious and very kind of efficient in his goal scoring, as his goal scoring records show. I mean, there was 365 Bundesliga goals in 427 games. It's still a Bundesliga record for goal scoring. 65 European Cup games in just 74 games, which is the highest ratio of any player. I think that's the thing. It's the ratio, isn't it? It's 62 games for Germany, 68 goals. And although that total has been beaten since, the ratio has never been beaten in that regard. So we're looking at the kind of most fertile era for him was between 70 and 76. And as we previously covered, it was a West Germany team that hadn't enjoyed success since 1954. They didn't do particularly well at the 1960 Euros, 1962 World Cup. It was a World Cup they were deemed to be like the favourites for, and they got knocked out in the quarterfinals to Yugoslavia. So entered into that era, and after 68 they didn't reach the quarterfinals of the European Championships there. So 70 he'd just come into the team. and this was a great era of success for the West German national team, wasn't it, Derek?
It was. It was a team built around a very, very strong Bayern spine. If you imagine, you had Meyer in goal, you had Beckenbauer, who was, I mean, they always called him a sweeper, but he was more of a midfielder in many ways. And then you had Hoeneß, and you had Müller, of course. And I think with those players, they were all part of the 72 European Championship winning squad. They were all part of the 1974 World Cup winning squad, and the majority of them, with the exception of Müller, of course, were finalists in the 76 European Championship. Müller could, of course, have played in those finals, and I think they would have probably won the tournament if he had played. But, you know, history has you know, a habit of throwing curveballs, and I think rather petulantly he retired because he fell out with the DFB.
Yeah, so moving on from that period, we'll go now into the crux of the question: is have West Germany / Germany ever really found a replacement for Gerd Müller? So we'll look at the period shortly after his retirement from the national game because of, as you say, the act of petulance after the 1974 World Cup final, which is a reoccurring theme. A lot of great German forwards, their last game was a World Cup final, but I suppose that's synonymous with being a great player, isn't it? You play until you can't play anymore, and your last game does tend to be a world tournament. But let's go through that kind of pantheon of German forwards who came afterwards, who were good players. But did they really sort of fill the void that was left by Gerd Müller? So would you like to run us through a few of those players, Derek, that came afterwards?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, Phil, when you mentioned ratio, because it's a ratio of games to goals, really, that make Müller stand out. And I know there'll be people who will say Müller wasn't the greatest striker because Klose has scored more goals than him in both individual World Cups and overall for the national team. And they'll say he played at a time when, you know, Germany were going to countries like Turkey and Malta and winning 9-0 and 13-0, and he was banging in 3 goals and 4 goals. But you can only play the team that's put in front of you. And football, I accept that football has changed, really, really changed in the last 20, 30 years. Müller would not be a great striker in modern football. That's not the way the game's played anymore. He's not big enough for a start. He's not fast enough for a start. And, you know, most of the strikers don't score goals around the 6-yard box anymore. They're expected to score them, you know, running through or, you know, headers or from the edge of the box, because defenses are pushing out much further now. But I think if you look at the goals to game ratio, there won't be any. Germany, well, I don't think any country will ever produce a player like that. I think football has changed. I think Müller will always be legendary. The first one really that was given a chance was, of course, Jupp Heynckes. I mean, Heynckes went on to be a fantastic manager, you know, brilliant. And he was a great striker from Mönchengladbach. And he won the UEFA Cup with them. So he wasn't a bad player. But take him into the national team, he couldn't score as often as Müller. So pretty soon they ditched him in favour of a contemporary of Müller, Klaus Fischer. Now, Klaus Fischer arrived really at roughly the same time as Müller in the Bundesliga. But of course, he got caught up in the bribery scandal of the early 70s. So he was banned for a number of seasons. And there was a lot of soul searching on the part of German football as to whether or not Fischer should be allowed back in. So he was back in for the 76 European Championship qualifiers, but unfortunately was injured for the finals, and his place was taken by another Müller, Dieter Müller, who of course scored those 2 goals in the final against Czechoslovakia. So that first period, they had 3 strikers, but none of them could get the goal to game ratio that Müller did.
Yeah, it was which would have been a tough ask in itself. I think in style, Klaus Fischer was probably the most redolent of Gerd Müller, because same size, pretty much a box player as well. I mean, and he would do anything he could to get the ball in the net like Gerd Müller. It didn't matter if it hit his backside, but also really good in the air as well, which is something that people overlook with Müller and Fischer. For men of their size, that their aerial ability was kind of it wasn't characteristic of men of that height.
No, the closest I can think of in football of a small man that was good in the air was Eric Black when he played for Aberdeen.
Yeah. He was.
We used to call him Spring-Heeled Jack, because he wasn't particularly tall, yet he was an amazing aerial player. He could outleap most of the defenders in the Scottish Premier League at that time.
Yeah, young Eric Black. Remember first being introduced in ball, because we've spoken about this before. My dad lived in Scotland for the majority of his kind of the last 42 years of his life, and he would talk about players that had caught his attention. Eric Black, of course, being one of them, because he was part of that successful Aberdeen side of the early to mid 80s. And he was a prodigious leaper, wasn't he? And scored a good percentage of goals with his head.
Yeah, and again, like Müller, he was another player who could hold the ball up and play with his back to goal. He was another one who sort of specialised in swivelling around, but unfortunately, injury really, really blighted his career.
Yeah.
But the 70s ended really with the emergence of Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, who a lot of people would have considered more of an attacking midfielder. Which brings me on to why did Germany start using him really much further forward? I guess because they thought he might be a replacement for Müller, and he did score as a midfielder more goals in the 78 World Cup finals in Argentina than their established striker at that time.
Yeah, but as you say, he wasn't the archetypal forward. He was that kind of link forward, wasn't he? But a fabulous player. But it surprised me when I looked at Karl-Heinz Rummenigge's statistics. I mean, it is an excellent ratio. It's scored about 1 every 2 games, but I always anticipated that he'd scored more than that, and I don't think, because he always seemed to be scoring, and but no, it was much less of a ratio than some of the other forwards in that role.
The one that surprised me the most, though, Phil, was Horst Rubesch. Now, I remember Rubesch as being a really bustling, very physical attacker with Hamburg, and I actually saw him play for Hamburg against Aberdeen at Pittodrie, and he scored the goal really that knocked us out. And I was surprised at how little he scored for the national team.
Yeah, he scored those 2 key goals in the final, didn't he, against Belgium in 1918? What's often lauded as the poorest European Championships of all time. I think there's probably a good argument for that as well. It was beset with violence and negative play, and it was very much a kind of very typical of Italian football in the early 80s to an extent, wasn't it? It was as if the tournament was infused by the Italian sentiment. Of course, the Italians didn't want that tournament; they wanted the World Cup, and they didn't get it. But yeah, Horst Rubesch, he scored the 2 goals in what was an untypically entertaining final, actually. But I think his success in the national team was driven by his relationship with his teammate Manny Counts. And Horst Rubesch quite flippantly used to say of Manny Counts, Manny puts the ball in the box and I score. And that was their relationship.
But how many national teams, Phil, are based around relationships from clubs? If you look at the Soviet Union teams of the 70s and 80s were built around Dynamo Kiev. The German side in the 70s were built around Bayern Munich. The Dutch side of the 70s were built around Ajax. So you need that sort of regular playing together to translate from club into country. And I'm surprised that more Hamburg players didn't play for Germany at that time.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's Felix Magath, and but they were a very solid unit, and they were very kind of successful in the latter part of the 1970s and early 80s. Of course, went on to win the European Cup in 1983.
I suppose people would argue that maybe they were more of an English-style German football team,
I think
especially with the influence of Keegan.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, but I would say that of a lot of German football, it's very kind of derivative of the British game, isn't it? It's very in the sense that when you think of Holland and Germany, you say if we hark back to 1974, there was a fluidity to the Dutch play, but the German the way the German setup was a much more functional in the sense it was get the ball into the box to Müller and he'll score the goals. Whereas Dutch, it was a bit more kind of interchangeable and total football. And we talk about it was a different style. But
I guess the word you might use is solidity, where the Dutch had fluidity, the Germans had solidity, and they were very hard. And I think that was the problem in the 74 final, which is really the first World Cup final I remember watching, is that after that initial goal, which was scored very early by the Dutch, they really couldn't play their way through the Germans.
yeah, they sort of like starved them of any kind of any any of the fluidity that they'd shown in the previous tournament. And they have
And with with Bertie Vogts running around, basically just nipping at the heels of Johan Cruyff for the whole game, the number of fouls, stop start, that didn't really suit the Dutch style of play. It suited the German style of play much better. And you've got, part of that's my admiration for German football is that the Germany know their limitations, and they know when they don't have a good side, and they know what to do to stop the other team playing. Although they seem to have forgotten how to do that at the moment. They've really become it's almost like charity week when you play Germany now, and that's why I'm looking forward to Scotland playing them in the opening game, because I actually think we might beat them. Because I don't think, although I think individually they're a very good team, together they seem to have forgotten how to stop other teams from playing.
Yeah.
And I think even when you think about how poor their team was at the 2002 World Cup, I mean, that was Klose's first World Cup, and he was really the only bright light from those finals. Well, him and Michael Ballack. I mean, Michael Ballack would drag a team through by their collar, but the Germans knew how to grind out results, and they knew how to stop teams playing. And if it hadn't been for Oliver Kahn's uncharacteristic mistake in the final, I think they might have been able to stop that Brazilian side from playing.
Yeah, they found a way to win in that tournament. It was ugly and it was boring, and some of those games, like the game against Paraguay, where I think Oliver Neuville scored with like about 2 minutes left. They were utterly dreadful. And against the USA, they won 1-0, and they were dreadful again. Against South Korea, they weren't, or maybe they were at their best. Maybe they just weren't great. But they went through with a procession of 1-0 victories in games that
They did.
In all of them, they didn't necessarily deserve to win, but that was the German mentality, and it is, as you say, it's something that they seem to have lost of late.
I mean, we mentioned Klose there. We're jumping ahead slightly, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. Yeah,
the man who many people think has replaced Müller in the 80s. Actually, wasn't a bad time for German strikers from like the 86 World Cup on. You had Rudi Völler, who anyone would consider a great striker, and scored a lot of goals for the national team. And then he was kind of eased out. Well, first of all, he was partnered by and then eased out by Jurgen Klinsmann, who a lot of people, well, I mean, is very beloved in England. The English love Jurgen Klinsmann as a man who could laugh at his own ability to dive. I remember that he won over the Premier League, didn't he, when he scored his first goal for Spurs and then did that dive.
And
people thought, here's a man that can laugh at himself. So the late 80s, early 90s, it did look like Völler or Klinsmann could replace Müller. And when you look at the goals that they scored, and I'm saying this as a Scotsman who We haven't had strikers who score like goals into the 30s and 40s. And here's Germany have had lots.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm saying they've never really replaced Müller, but they've had lots of people that have scored 30 goals for national team, 40 goals for national team. But yet it's a number of games that they've taken to do that, the longevity. Maybe we just expect Germans to just score goals, whereas here in England, I mean, the record goal scorer is well, it's Harry Kane now, isn't it? 50,
Yeah,
51, it might be
50
52.
something. Yeah.
How many of them are penalties?
Of course, yeah. Muller's with very few penalties, and also you have to
Very few.
take into effect that, I mean, that was over an 8-year period. His first cap was in 1966 and his last was in 74. 68 goals in 8 years. That's an incredible ratio.
And then remember that period between 66 and 70, he wasn't a regular starter for the German national team. You know, they had other strikers ahead of the queue. It was that burst of goal scoring in Mexico, in particular the quarterfinal in Lyon, really, that people said he's arrived. This is the main man now.
Yeah, and it was the nature of the goals. And you always see, you always look at Muller, and he seemed to be able to sniff out chances where there weren't even chances, like the goal against Italy, where he just prods it beyond the keeper after a mix-up that nobody could have foresaw in what was a pretty bolt-tight Italian back four.
Yeah.
And he was just able to find somehow find a way of scoring goals. He was quite remarkable, really.
Well, the Germans were, you know, seriously damaged by that loss against the Italians. You know, after they defeated the champions England in the quarterfinal, they really thought they'd a great chance against Germany, and really it was a kick in the teeth. And a lot of countries would not have recovered from that. And to come back 2 years later and win the European Championship and then build that side that went on to win the World Cup in 74. But again, Germany were flying under the radar. Although they were European champions, the Dutch were, of course, the team that everyone adopted and wanted to win. And it was weird because I remember at school, everybody wanted Holland to win. And I was like, oh, yeah, I really like the Dutch. They're really good. Cruyff's a great player. And he was a great player. But I didn't want to admit that I wanted the Germans to win.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And it was the same in 82. I watched the 1982 final in a bar in Spain. I was 16 years old and I watched it, and everyone was supporting Italy except me.
Honestly, my first World Cup final was the 1978 World Cup final, and everybody wanted Holland to win. But I always had a thing for Argentina. I always have done. Even being an Englishman and going through the kind of Maradona '86 thing, I've still got this. There's still this kind of love of Argentina. I was delighted when they won the World Cup. It was. And that stems from, I suppose, your beginnings as a football fan, doesn't it? Where what you remember, and that '78 World Cup final against Holland was just so memorable. And not, I always say this, not a particularly great game, but a great final. The colour of the kits and the ticker tape and the nature of the goals, all rough and tumble and a mess, really. But
the commentary.
Yeah,
and the commentary coming down the telephone line.
Yeah,
I mean, my memories of that final is Kempish dancing through all the ticker tape to score that goal.
Yeah, just get his toe on the end of it. So yeah. In kind of ironically, in a very kind of Muller-esque kind of way as well.
Yes. I mean, I watched those finals hoping that Germany. I mean, I didn't expect Germany to win that World Cup simply because they didn't have Müller. And that had shown in the '76 European Championships that they needed a striker with his, you know, ability to sniff out chances. And I think that was where the Germans started to rebuild their team. I mean, it was aging at that point. By 1982, of course, Meyer was no longer in goals. I don't think Uli Hoeneß was playing. I think he'd been injury blighted. I don't think he was in the '82. He might have been in the squad. He certainly wasn't in the team for the final. Beckenbauer had retired. Müller had retired by then. I think he was playing in America by the early '80s. So the Germans were rebuilding, and they made 3 finals on the trot: 82, 86, and 90. Eventually winning it in 90. You can't argue with their record as a team. You can only argue with the fact that they had all these strikers, and they just couldn't get that goal to game ratio that you talk about, Phil. It just wasn't there. And football hadn't changed that much. This wasn't the era of modern football that we live in. Football was pretty much the same in the 80s as it was in the 70s.
I think you're
You know,
absolutely right.
tactics hadn't, you know, players were not being coached within an inch of their life like they are now. And so why couldn't they get, and it wasn't like teams were getting any better. Malta were still there to be hammered 9-0. Turkey were still there to be hammered 9-0. It's an era where Scotland qualified for World Cups. I mean, my God, it was like the long 1970s. So I don't know what it was about Germany. They just couldn't get a replacement for them, and maybe they never will. Maybe they never will.
Yeah, I mean that's the question. Is it what? Well, Gerd Müller, we can definitely say he was a one-off. Will Germany or any other country, for that matter, see a forward of his type with similar statistics ever again? Well, I think we have the answer for that, don't we? I don't think it can happen.
Well, who do you think might be the closest? Is Haaland the closest?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, his statistics seem to be kind of edging in that direction, don't they? But as you say, it's a different time and they're different players. And you mentioned that players are trained within an inch of their life. There doesn't seem to be room for that kind of outsider of a player, if you know what I mean. Haaland evidently is a very talented forward. But he's not Gerd Müller, because I don't think, as you said earlier, a player of his type would even be considered nowadays. He was a complete breaker of the mold. There was nothing like him before, and certainly nothing like him since. So, what kind of legacy does that leave for Germany? Maybe you'd like to go into that. Where do they go? Or
I think maybe they have to go. Maybe they have to do a Das Reboot too. I don't know if you've read Uli Hess's book Das Reboot.
I haven't. No.
And yeah, he talks about the real low points of German football, the Euro 2000, 2004. Again, another terrible European championship for Germany. But they knew they had to rebuild because they were hosting the 2006 World Cup. And I remember my son is also a big fan of German football, and that was really the first World Cup that he kind of got interested in football. And he asked me if Germany would win the World Cup, and I said, Campbell, I'm not even sure Germany will win their group because they were very much considered one of the weakest host nation sides that there'd been for a long time. And I mean, this was an era where the USA had hosted a World Cup, and yet, okay, it was before South Africa, but you know, the Germans were viewed as being very weak, and here they made it all the way to semi-finals and were very unlucky. It was a wonder goal by the Italians, really, that knocked them out, and I still think that would have been a great final, that France team against that Germany team.
Yeah,
the experience of the French side against the youth of the German side, and I think it would have been very tough to call who would have won that.
Yeah, and you have to look at the home advantage of it all as well, don't you? It's a fascinating subject, and a lot of kind of hypotheses and what if. We had a guest on the other week who did a what if thing. But what if Germany would have reached that final? Would have they added to their hoard of trophies? Quite possibly, yeah.
Well, look at the strikers. Look at the strikers that were emerging in that 2006 to 2014 era for Germany. You had Podolski, and you had Klose. Klose had arrived at the 2002 World Cup, so he was already established. Although he'd had a very big dip in form and wasn't expected to score many goals anyway. He had injury problems too. So you had Klose, Podolski arrived then. Shortly afterwards, Thomas Müller. All three of them with international goal scoring records that you would, if you were any other country in the world, you would bite their hand off. But it's not Gerd Müller's ratio, is it?
No, that's right. And even like we predate that, and people like Oliver Bierhofer, who to me was, he really shouldn't have any place in the West German national side, but he earned 70 caps, scored 37 goals. So again, you say these players who kind of racked up the goals for Germany, they've always created goal scorers, but never a goal scorer with a ratio of Gerd Müller. It's a conversation that could go on forever, isn't it, really, mate? But thank you for talking to us about it today. Now, would you like to tell us about your other projects that are in the pipeline? Because I know there's something up and coming, isn't there?
Yeah, I'm currently writing a book about my experiences in the Subbuteo community. It's called Land of the Giants: My Journey Through the World of Table Football. And it's due out on pitch, I think, around the August-September time. I've got a deadline to finish writing it by the end of March and get it off to the publishers by then. So I think I've only got one chapter left to write, but a couple of loose interviews that I still need to pin people down for. But yeah, it's looking like it's going to be post 80,000 words. I don't know what Paul Cameron's going to say when I rock up with 82,000 words, but hey, I think it's important enough to go in there. It should stay in there.
That's right. He's a sweetheart. He'll be absolutely fine about it, I'm sure. But you created a lovely piece for me, didn't you? You did the Hamburg pink kit for me.
That's right, the pink kit,
which has pride of place in my football room, which I've commandeered downstairs from the wife with much argument. but there it is, and
I've got my mug.
Oh, amazing! Well, it's a book that I'm certainly going to look forward to. I played Subbuteo when I was a younger lad, and I really love the game. I don't think there's any other football game like it. So I'll look forward to that. And when that comes out, we'll see you again on the show, no doubt, and we'll talk about it at more length. But Derek, it's been fabulous having you on the show. Thank you for taking your time out to talk to us.
No, thank you. Can I just do a little plug for Halvir and Fergal, who edits it and put it together? It is a tremendous friendly that loves football, let alone even German football. Halvir is a tremendous example of citizen journalism. You know, there's very few professional writers who write for them. It's people like you and I, people for whom this is a passion and a hobby. So, you know, get online, subscribe to Halvir. It's a tremendous read.
That's fantastic, mate. Yeah, I'll second that. This kind of civilian kind of journalism is the way forward, because you get honest. You don't get any of the rubbish that's spouted or agenderized in the conventional football press. So go out there, have a look, check it out, and enjoy, guys. Well, until next time, thank you, Derek. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Phil.
It's been a pleasure having you, sir. And we'll see you next time on Football Geeks. Bye for now.
Yes, with a pleasure. Well done. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, mate.